Realize that's somehow worse than any reason she could have given. If she'd said I looked healthier or cried less or had a birthmark she loved, at least that would be something. But random? A coin flip that determined everything about both our lives? I ask her if she ever thought about the other baby, the one she gave away. She starts crying and says she tried not to. She says she had to believe she made the right choice or she couldn't have lived with herself. I tell her I have to go and hang up before she can respond. I sit on my couch and stare at the wall for an hour. My first therapy appointment with Fern Collier feels awkward and forced because I don't know how to explain that my best friend of 8 years was actually my twin sister plotting to destroy my life. Her office is small and painted a calming blue color. There are plants on the windowsill and tissues on the side table. She's maybe 50, with gray hair and kind eyes. She asks me to tell her what brought me in, and I start talking. The words come out jumbled and wrong. I keep backtracking to explain things out of order. She listens without judgment and asks me what I'm most afraid of right now. I tell her the truth. Meredith is still out there, still watching, and I have no way to protect myself from someone who knows everything about me. She knows my schedule, my habits, my favorite places. She knows which window in my bedroom doesn't lock properly. She knows I keep my spare car key in my desk drawer. She spent 8 years learning every detail of my life. Fern asks what I'm doing to feel safe, and I tell her about checking the locks 3 times every night. She doesn't tell me to stop. She says that's a normal response to trauma, and we'll work on managing the anxiety so it doesn't control my life. I cry for the last 10 minutes of the session, and she hands me tissues without making it weird. Alexander files a motion to have my bail conditions modified, so I can at least travel within the state. He argues that I'm clearly not a flight risk, given that I reported the framing myself, and have cooperated fully with the investigation. The prosecutor, Donovan Baird, doesn't oppose it, which Alexander says is a good sign that they're not seriously pursuing charges against me anymore. The hearing is scheduled for Friday morning. I wear a conservative dress and sit quietly while Alexander presents his argument to the judge. The judge is a woman in her 60s who looks stern but fair. She reviews the motion for what feels like forever but is probably 5 minutes. Then she approves it. Just like that, I can travel within state lines. I feel a tiny bit of freedom return, even though I have nowhere I want to go. Alexander shakes my hand outside the courtroom and tells me this is real progress. I thank him and drive home, feeling slightly less trapped than I did this morning. Detective Swift contacts me with news that they found surveillance footage from a gas station near Caleb's apartment. The footage shows Meredith filling up a car 2 hours before his estimated time of death. Swift emails me a screenshot from the video. The image is grainy but clearly shows her face. She's wearing my jacket, the brown leather one that went missing from my closet 3 months ago. I'd looked everywhere for that jacket. I'd assumed I'd left it somewhere and forgotten. But no, Meredith took it. She wore it to pump gas before murdering Caleb, making sure the cameras caught her in my clothes. This evidence further proves the framing, but it also confirms Meredith was meticulous about every detail. She thought about security cameras. She planned what to wear. She probably drove past that gas station multiple times to confirm it had cameras pointed at the pumps. Swift tells me this footage will help my case significantly. I thank her and stare at the screenshot for a long time. My sister is looking slightly away from the camera, her expression calm and focused. She looks like me. We have the same face, the same hair, the same build. Anyone who saw this footage would think it was me. I drive past the coffee shop where Meredith and I used to have brunch, but I can't bring myself to go inside yet. Instead, I park across the street and watch through the window as other people sit at tables and have normal conversations. A couple in their 20s laughs about something. An older man reads a newspaper while drinking coffee. A woman types on her laptop, probably working remotely. None of them are wondering if the person across from them is secretly plotting their destruction. None of them are checking over their shoulders constantly. I sit there for 20 minutes just watching normal people do normal things. My hands grip the steering wheel tightly. I want to go inside. I want to reclaim that space and those Saturday mornings, but I can't make myself open the car door. Finally, I start the engine and drive away, feeling pathetic but unable to reclaim that space yet. Maybe next week, maybe never. The next morning, my neighbor knocked on my door around 8. I'd been up for hours already, checking the locks again and staring at my phone. She looked nervous, kept glancing down the hallway like she wasn't sure she should be here. She told me she saw someone who looked exactly like me leaving my apartment the day Caleb died. She'd thought it was me at first, but then she noticed the shoes. Black heels, the kind with the pointed toe. She said I always wore flats or sneakers, never heels like that. The detail seemed small, but it stuck with her, made her feel weird about it. When she saw the police at my door days later, she started putting things together. I thanked her 3 times, my voice shaking, and asked if she'd give a statement to Detective Swift. She agreed right away, said she'd call the detective herself that afternoon. After she left, I stood in my doorway for a full minute just breathing. Someone else saw Meredith. Someone else could prove I wasn't the one at that apartment. Alexander called me 2 hours later with more news from the forensic team. They'd found Meredith's fingerprints in my apartment, but not in normal places. Inside my medicine cabinet, way in the back where I kept old prescription bottles I never touched. Inside my dresser drawers, underneath the clothes. In the back of my closet, behind boxes of winter stuff I hadn't opened in months. She'd been going through everything, taking inventory of my entire life. The analyst told Alexander it looked like someone conducting a search, not just visiting casually. I felt sick hearing this. Meredith had touched my things, moved them around, studied what I owned. She'd been in my bathroom, my bedroom, my private spaces. The framing felt almost easier to process than this. She'd invaded every corner of my home while pretending to be my sister, my friend. Alexander asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes. I wasn't okay. I wanted to throw away everything I owned and start over in a place she'd never been. 3 days later, I sat in Donovan Baird's office downtown. The building was all glass and steel, modern and cold. Alexander came with me, sat beside me in the chair across from the prosecutor's desk. Donovan looked tired, like he'd been working too many cases for too many years. He told me directly that his office wasn't going to prosecute me. They were preparing to dismiss all charges formally. The evidence pointed clearly to Meredith now, and they were shifting all their resources to finding her. He apologized for what I'd been through, said he understood this had been horrible for me. I should have felt relieved. Alexander squeezed my shoulder, smiled at me, but I just felt empty. Clearing my name didn't undo what Meredith did. It didn't explain why she hated me enough to plan this for 8 years. It didn't bring me any closer to understanding how someone could pretend to love me while plotting my destruction. I thanked Donovan and left his office feeling hollow instead of free. My second therapy session with Fern happened on a Thursday afternoon. Her office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, the kind of place designed to make you feel safe enough to fall apart. We talked about my sleep, my anxiety, the constant checking of locks. Then she asked me what I missed most about Meredith. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the anger and fear, that I hadn't let myself think about missing her. But sitting there in that quiet office, I admitted the truth. I missed having a sister. I missed the feeling of having someone who understood me completely, who knew my history and my quirks and loved me anyway. Then I started crying. Big ugly sobs that I couldn't control. Because that person never existed. Everything I thought we shared was just Meredith studying me like I was some kind of experiment. Every laugh, every secret, every moment I thought we were connecting was her taking notes for my destruction. Fern handed me tissues and let me cry until I couldn't anymore. She didn't try to fix it or make it better. She just sat with me in the grief of losing someone who was never really there. Detective Swift called me the following week with news about the adoption records. She'd gotten them unsealed through a court order. Meredith had been placed with a family in Oregon right after birth. They returned her to the agency after 6 months. The paperwork said she was difficult and hard to manage as an infant. She spent 2 years in foster care after that, moving between different homes. Then a couple in Washington adopted her when she was 3. They raised her until she turned 18, but the detective said there were notes about behavioral problems and running away. My parents' decision to give her up created this whole childhood of abandonment and moving around. I got to stay in one house, with parents who wanted me, going to the same school and having the same friends. Meredith got returned like a broken product, shuffled around, never settling anywhere. I understood her anger better after hearing this. I still couldn't forgive what she did, but I understood where it came from. One random choice at birth gave me everything and gave her nothing. I forced myself to go back to work on Monday. The marketing firm where I'd worked for 3 years felt different now. Everyone knew what happened because it had been in the news. My coworkers were awkwardly nice, giving me space but also checking on me constantly. Sarah from accounting brought me coffee without asking. Mike from creative told me to take my time on deadlines. My boss called me into her office and told me to take whatever time I needed, that my job was secure. I insisted on working because sitting at home thinking about Meredith all day was making me crazy. I needed tasks, deadlines, normal work problems to focus on. By Wednesday, I'd finished 2 projects and felt almost like myself again. Work gave me structure, gave me something to do besides obsess over where Meredith was hiding. Alexander met me for coffee that Friday to update me on the investigation. He told me Interpol had been notified about Meredith. Her photo was distributed to law enforcement in dozens of countries, but he was honest with me in a way I appreciated. People disappear successfully all the time, especially when they've been planning it for years like Meredith had. She probably had multiple fake identities set up, money hidden in offshore accounts, an exit plan as detailed as her framing plan. The chances of finding her were slim. Even if they did locate her, getting her back to the country could take years. Extradition was complicated and slow. I stirred my coffee and watched the foam swirl. Alexander looked at me with genuine sympathy. He said he was sorry, that he wished he had better news. I told him I appreciated his honesty. At least I knew what I was dealing with. Meredith was gone, probably forever, and I had to figure out how to live with that. The nightmares started that week. Every night I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, convinced Meredith was standing at the foot of my bed watching me. I'd turn on every light, check every window, test every lock. Then I'd lie awake until sunrise, too scared to close my eyes again. The bags under my eyes got darker each day. I looked exhausted all the time. Fern told me this was a normal response to trauma, that my brain was processing the violation of trust and safety. Knowing it was normal didn't make it less scary. I was tired constantly, could barely focus at work. I started drinking coffee all day just to stay awake. My hands shook from the caffeine and the lack of sleep. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. I looked older, worn down, like I'd aged 5 years in the past month. My father called me for the first time since everything came out. His voice sounded strained, like he'd been practicing what to say. He tried to explain their decision. They were young when we were born, only 23. They were scared and broke, and the doctors told them raising twins would be twice as hard. They thought they were making the practical choice, the responsible choice. I listened without saying much because nothing he said would make this okay. We both knew it. The silence on the phone stretched out between us. Finally, he asked if I'd come to dinner this weekend. I told him I needed more time. He said he understood, but I could hear the hurt in his voice. I felt guilty, but also angry. They created this situation. They gave away my sister and never told me. Their guilt didn't fix anything. The coffee shop owner reached out to Detective Swift a few days later. Alexander called to tell me what she'd said. She remembered Meredith asking detailed questions about me over the years. What time did I usually arrive for brunch? Did I always order the same thing? What did I talk about? At the time, she thought Meredith was just being a caring sister, paying attention to my habits. Looking back, she realized Meredith was gathering information, studying my patterns. The owner felt terrible about it, offered to testify if Meredith was ever caught. I told Alexander to let her know she had nothing to feel guilty about. How could she have known? How could any of us have known? Meredith was that good at pretending, that patient in her planning. She fooled everyone, including me, for 8 solid years. I started going through my apartment the next morning, room by room, pulling out anything Meredith had ever given me. The necklace she'd bought me for my birthday sat on my dresser, a simple silver chain with a small pendant. I picked it up and looked at it for a long moment before dropping it in the trash bag. A throw pillow she'd said would match my couch perfectly went in next. 3 books she'd recommended, each one with her handwriting on the inside cover saying she thought I'd love them. A framed photo of us at a concert. A coffee maker she'd replaced when mine broke. Each item felt contaminated now, like touching them might somehow connect me back to her plans. I worked through every drawer, every closet, every shelf. By the time I finished, the trash bag was full and my apartment looked bare. The empty spaces on my shelves and walls made the place feel hollow, but at least I could breathe without seeing reminders of her everywhere I looked. I tied up the bag and carried it down to the dumpster, feeling lighter with each step away from my building. Detective Swift called 3 days later while I was at work. She asked if I could come to the station after my shift ended. I agreed and spent the rest of the day distracted, wondering what new information they'd found. When I arrived that evening, Swift led me to the same interview room where this whole nightmare had started. She spread photos across the table, showing a rundown motel about 30 miles outside the city. The sign out front advertised weekly rates and cable TV. Swift explained that they'd traced Meredith's movements in the weeks before Caleb's murder. She hadn't been living at the apartment address she'd given me at all. She'd been staying at this motel, paying cash every week, using a fake name. The clerk barely remembered her, said she kept to herself and never caused any problems. Swift showed me more photos, surveillance footage from the motel parking lot showing Meredith coming and going at odd hours. She'd been creating the illusion of her normal life with me while actually preparing for everything. The murder, the framing, her disappearance, all of it planned from that cheap motel room while I thought she was living her regular life across town. I stared at the grainy images of my sister walking to and from a motel room I'd never known existed. Swift said they'd searched the room after Meredith left, but it had been cleaned completely. No evidence, no clues about where she'd gone next. My therapy session with Fern the following week felt different. I told her about finding the motel photos, about how Meredith had been living this secret life right under my nose. Fern listened carefully, then introduced me to a concept I'd never heard before. Ambiguous loss, she called it. Grief for someone who isn't dead but is permanently gone from your life. She explained that it's often harder than regular grief because there's no closure, no funeral, no clear moment where you can say it's over and start moving forward. The mourning process never really ends because part of you keeps waiting for resolution that might never come. I sat with that idea for a while, feeling it settle into place. That was exactly what I was experiencing with Meredith. She wasn't dead, but she was gone in every way that mattered. I couldn't grieve her like I would a death because she was still out there somewhere, still a threat, still unresolved. Fern said naming these feelings sometimes makes them easier to carry. I wasn't sure I believed her, but having words for what I was going through did make me feel slightly less alone in it. A letter arrived at Detective Swift's office 2 weeks later, forwarded to her from the Washington couple who had adopted Meredith when she was 3 years old. Swift called me to come pick it up. The envelope was thick, several pages of careful handwriting on nice stationery. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot and read it. The couple expressed deep regret for not being able to help Meredith work through her abandonment issues when she was growing up. They described her as a difficult child who became increasingly troubled as a teenager. She'd run away multiple times, refused therapy, pulled away from any attempt they made to connect with her. At 17, she'd disappeared for good, and when she turned 18, she'd sent them a single letter saying she didn't want any further contact. They respected her wishes, hoping she'd reach out when she was ready. They had no idea she'd found me or what she was planning. The letter ended with an apology, as if they somehow could have prevented all of this if they'd just tried harder or done something different. I folded the pages carefully and put them back in the envelope. These people had tried to give Meredith a home, a family, a chance. She'd rejected all of it because it wasn't the life she thought she deserved. The life I had instead of her. Alexander called me at work the next Monday. His voice sounded pleased when he said the prosecutor's office had officially dismissed all charges against me. The case was closed as far as I was concerned. I should have felt relieved, maybe even happy. Instead, I just felt numb. I thanked him for his work, told him I appreciated everything he'd done. He surprised me by saying he planned to continue helping me pro bono if Meredith was ever located. He wanted to pursue any civil remedies we could, make sure she faced consequences for the identity theft and fraud, even if the murder charges were complicated by her disappearance. I didn't know what to say. Most lawyers would have moved on to their next case, but Alexander seemed genuinely invested in seeing this through. I told him I was grateful, and I meant it. The charges being dismissed should have felt like a victory, but my life was still destroyed in every way that mattered. My reputation was damaged, my sense of safety was gone, and my sister was out there somewhere, free and unpunished. My coworkers invited me to happy hour that Friday, trying to include me in normal social activities again. I forced myself to go, determined to prove I could still do regular things like a regular person. The bar was loud and crowded, everyone laughing and complaining about work stuff that seemed so trivial compared to what I'd been through. I lasted about 30 minutes before the noise became overwhelming and I had to leave. Everyone else was having conversations about difficult bosses and annoying clients and bad dates. Their problems felt so normal, so manageable. I stood there with my drink, feeling like I was watching them through glass, unable to connect with a world where the worst betrayal was a cheating boyfriend or getting passed over for a promotion. I made an excuse about not feeling well and left early. In my car, I sat with my head against the steering wheel, frustrated by how damaged I felt. Meredith had taken away my ability to just exist normally with other people. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. I saw her through the peephole and almost didn't open the door. Curiosity won out over anger. She looked older than I remembered, more gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. She was carrying a cardboard box, and when I let her in, she set it on my coffee table without saying anything at first. Inside were old photos from when I was a baby. She sat next to me on the couch, and we looked through them together. 2 identical infants in every picture, one in a pink onesie, one in yellow. One being held by my father, one by my mother. She pointed to a photo and admitted she didn't know which baby was which. They'd dressed us differently to tell us apart, but in these pictures, she couldn't remember which outfit belonged to which twin. We could be looking at photos of me or photos of Meredith, and there was no way to know. She said something that made my stomach turn. She sometimes wondered if they'd accidentally sent home the wrong twin from the hospital. If maybe I was actually Meredith and Meredith was actually me. I stared at her, not knowing how to respond to that. The idea that our entire lives might have been swapped by chance, that she might have kept the wrong daughter and given away the one she'd meant to keep. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it made everything feel even more random and cruel. Detective Swift called me again a few days later with more bad news. They'd found evidence that Meredith had been using my identity to open credit cards and bank accounts over the past year. The amounts were significant, nearly $50,000 that she'd never have to pay back because it was all in my name. Swift walked me through the accounts they'd found so far, but she warned there might be more they hadn't discovered yet. I felt sick listening to the list. Meredith had been building financial resources for her disappearance while destroying my credit and leaving me with debt I'd never agreed to. Alexander helped me file fraud reports with every bank and credit card company. We froze my credit, filed police reports, started the long process of proving I hadn't opened these accounts. He explained it could take months or even years to fully clear my name financially. The identity theft was just another layer of violation on top of everything else she'd done. Every time I thought I understood the full scope of her betrayal, something new emerged to show me it went even deeper than I'd imagined. Fern had recommended a support group for victims of stalking and identity theft. I'd been putting it off, not wanting to sit in a room full of strangers and share my story. But after learning about the financial fraud, I decided to give it a try. The group met in a church basement on Tuesday evenings. About 8 people sat in a circle of folding chairs. A woman around my age talked about how her ex-boyfriend had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit, opening accounts and taking out loans in her name before disappearing. The details were different from my situation, but the feeling she described was exactly the same. Having your life hijacked by someone you trusted. Feeling violated in a way that went beyond just the financial damage. When it was my turn to share, I gave a brief version of my story. I didn't go into all the details, just said my sister had framed me for murder and stolen my identity. People nodded with understanding that felt genuine. No one looked shocked or asked intrusive questions. They just listened and understood. For the first time since this started, I was in a room full of people who got it without me having to explain. The prosecutor's office held a press conference the following week, announcing that I'd been cleared, and they were actively searching for Meredith. My name was all over the news again. I had to take the day off work because reporters showed up at my office building trying to get a statement. They called my cell phone, sent emails, even knocked on my apartment door. Alexander handled all the media inquiries. He gave a brief statement saying I was relieved to be cleared and hoped law enforcement would locate my sister soon. I was grateful he dealt with it because I had nothing to say that wouldn't sound either pathetic or full of rage. The news coverage dredged everything back up. My coworkers, who had finally stopped walking on eggshells around me, went back to giving me sympathetic looks. Strangers recognized me at the grocery store. I stayed home for 3 days, ordering food delivery and ignoring my phone, waiting for the media attention to die down again. I took a week before I could make myself walk back to the coffee shop. The building looked exactly the same from the outside. Same brick walls and painted sign, but everything felt different now. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching people go in and out like it was any normal day. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I finally forced myself to get out and cross the street. The door chimed when I pushed it open. The owner looked up from behind the counter and her face changed immediately. She came around fast and pulled me into a hug before I could say anything. She smelled like coffee and vanilla. She pulled back and held my shoulders, looking at me with tears in her eyes. She said she was so sorry, that she never saw what was happening, that she'd answered questions from the police and felt sick about every conversation she'd ever had with Meredith. I told her it wasn't her fault. She insisted on making my usual coffee for free. I took it and looked at our table by the window, the one we'd sat at every Saturday for years. I couldn't sit there. I chose a different table near the back, facing the door so I could see everyone who came in. The coffee tasted the same, but drinking it alone felt wrong. I made myself finish the whole cup before leaving. When I told Fern about it at my next session, she said reclaiming spaces was an important part of healing. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I'd done it anyway. Detective Swift called 2 days later and asked me to come to the station. She had something to show me. I drove there with my stomach in knots, not knowing what to expect. She led me to a small room with a computer screen and pulled up security footage, The timestamp showed dates from 3 years ago. The footage was grainy black and white from a storage facility. She explained this was the place where they'd found Meredith's notebook. I watched the screen. A woman walked into frame and I recognized her